we have a small problem with firearms licensing in this country, and you're from three forces. And I know one of the things you want to do is reassurance, and I'm very glad you're here to do that. But can we start with acknowledgement? I mean, different constabularies, different forces, different problems. Let's call it a challenge, shall we? What challenges do you face in Warwickshire, first of all, in firearms licensing?
Well, from a Warwickshire perspective, there are no challenges.
You're one of the good guys.
Well, it's not a case of one of the good guys. Firearms licensing is obviously inconsistent across the UK at the moment with the different forces, but your direct question is obviously towards Warwickshire. If you're looking at facts and figures, we turn our grants and renewals around in around a calendar month. But it's really important when you start talking about turnaround times. Firearms licence is obviously really important, and if there are issues around suitability, then obviously that will take far longer to work through, be it medical or people's different pathways, etc. So whilst I acknowledge that many people look at how quickly can we deal with the licence, it all depends on that person's obviously pathway and route in life.
Chris, compared to Adrian, where's the Metropolitan Police? Compared to Warwickshire Police, where are you on firearms licensing? Have you got a kind of internal ranking for who's doing well and who's doing badly, or is it silly to treat it like that?
Sorry. Is that working? Oh, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, I'm Chris. 23 years as a police officer. I've done all sorts of bits and bobs within that role and had a great time. This, for me, is a brilliant role. Please, if you bear with me, I'll try and tell you about and give you some reassurance about what we're doing here. So, it's really hard to compare forces. Real different set of challenges, and you know, I appreciate for the licensing community, turnaround time is a big thing. Absolutely. What's really important for me and for all of you in a slightly different sense is that the quality of our work is right. We have unfortunately seen some tragedies where the quality of our work hasn't been good, and they cause a big impact on the shooting community. My biggest challenge at the moment is around grant of new certificates. There's a very long story behind it, but during COVID, we weren't able to go out and visit people face to face as is required, and that took us away from our work for about a 16-month period. When we reopened the grant facility, we got our usual 16 months worth of demand in month number 1. And then we got our usual monthly demand every month after that, which is a real challenge, in all honesty. Firearms licensing isn't the most difficult part of policing, but it's also got a number of subtleties and complexities to it. So it's very difficult for me to just pick a number of staff members and try and drop them into it. So it has taken us some time. We've made some good progress around our turnaround times. We are now much more towards the 8-month-ish level for a new grant, and we're working on moving that better and improving that again by the end of this year.
Chris, can I just pick you up on that? Just two things. I mean, two little things within that. Some forces didn't have that problem. I mean, some forces, Lincolnshire, for example, has been pretty good all the way through. And there was, would you acknowledge there was a communication problem to the shooting community about how firearms licensing worked during that time? It seemed to be that basically the office door got locked and then it got reopened after COVID, and you were, as you say, faced with all these applications.
So that's not strictly speaking true. Very different, very difficult to compare forces. I benefit from my force in that I have a number of warranted officers, police officers available to me. But as you'll agree, COVID, a time of national panic, lots of uncertainty. So 50% of my team were redeployed to the streets. Other forces might have had a civilian workforce that weren't similarly impacted on that. But that's what caused us some of our issues, our workload around renewals, variations we took a pause on, but our renewals absolutely maintained, not a problem at all. It would be wrong to suggest that the door was locked, but it would also be right to acknowledge that there was a lot of other challenges going on at that particular time.
Brilliant. Thank you. Paul, Essex, how did you get on?
Essex is fine.
Anybody here from Essex? Just to second that. And no, you got away with it.
And if it does stem back to the pandemic, although nobody could be ready for that because it was unprecedented, we were in front of the game. We would already moved to electronic processes. So when we got the shout, you've all got to go home, instead of all the paper still sitting on the desks in the office, we were already electronic. So we just had to adapt our processes and procedures. And yes, we had to turn grants off the same as everybody else because it's mandatory to do the home visit and we weren't allowed to visit homes. Coming out the other side of that, Essex are in a really, really good position. The average turnaround time, and I agree with Chris, we shouldn't be judging on turnaround times because it's the safety and the quality of the applications that we need to abide by. But our turnaround times on grants and renewals, roughly 30 days.
Good, really good.
And that was as of yesterday when I ran the figures.
Adrian, you want to say something?
Yeah, so obviously we've discussed forces that are obviously doing well. It's really important there's national consistency around firearms licensing. So we're working with forces that do have more backlogs. And with some forces it is up to 12 months. Temporary permits has been a real issue across UK licensing. There were several forces with a significant amount of temporary permits, which were obviously being picked up by licence holders, shooting groups and organisations and us as well. The good news is that those stubborn figures of temporary permits are now starting to budge. A lot of forces have brought those down, and rightfully so, because temporary permits shouldn't be used to obviously support firearms licensing backlog. And even some of the larger forces with larger numbers are now starting to bring those numbers down. So hopefully that'll be a much more consistent picture as we move towards the end of the year.
There was more, wasn't there? Because in August 2021, there was that tragedy in Plymouth where a shotgun certificate holder massacred other people, killed other people. And then, from your point of view, there was the Home Office guidance that followed in November that year from Priti Patel, who was then Home Secretary. Did that help speed things up, or did it slow things down? Chris, I don't want you to make a political point here, but I mean, how was that in terms of how the force ran?
Again, being perfectly straightforward, the main provision around statutory guidance that caused us a lot of challenges was around medical evidence. Previously, the system had been around self-declaration, and it caused some issues. I think it would be fair to say that some GPs took on their responsibilities more enthusiastically than others, and I think that position maintains. Some people's GPs very, very good, some less so, unfortunately. And that's a real difficult position. When you're trying to plan for your certificate renewal and all of a sudden there's an unexpected hold-up that you weren't predicting to have, that's a real challenge to negotiate that. I think in our force moving forward, that situation has vastly improved over the last 12 to 18 months. In the last 3 months, we processed between 99 and 100% of all our renewals ahead of expiration date, which is good. The other part that's important for you as in the shooting community is it revealed to us a number of people who hadn't properly declared in the past. Some of those were very, very compassionate conversations that needed to be had, and some of those were deliberately deceitful withholding of information from us.
They're quite easy, aren't they? You just remove the certificate. I mean, if they're lying to you, that's that, isn't it?
It's slightly more complicated than that. In that, you might have visited your GP for the last 12, however many years, and being perfectly honest when you filled in that form and said that you didn't have any depression. However, one day, 8 years ago, let's say, for example, you walked in and you were having your tonsils out, and you happened to have a discussion with your GP about the fact that you were, a bit stressed at work. comes in waves, doesn't it? And you were a bit stressed at work. Now, your GP perfectly well-meaningly wrote that conversation on your medical record. And then when they completed that pro forma, it came back and it highlighted to us that you hadn't declared this bit of depression. Now, there's a couple of issues there, but again, it's a conversation starter for us, and it's a compassionate conversation, and it might well be that was perfectly well-meaned and intended, and there wasn't deceit around that. Some of the cases that we've seen, that's obviously not the case, and please let me reassure you that as a whole, although it was a difficult birth, the provision of medical evidence is actually a good thing for the shooting community
and you reckon
as a wider whole.
It's going to work. You reckon it's going to work? I mean, we're still kind of struggling with it because there's a huge change in culture for how we apply for shotgun and firearm certificates. But your prediction is that the medical certificate thing will work.
It will. Firstly, I think A, it already works, and B, I think it will continue to improve with time. It will become something of a. It will just become the new normal, if I'm perfectly honest, for shooting, for the shooting or groups and individuals. What I always say to people is, go home, look at your ticket, see when it expires, take 6 months away from that, write it down and stick it on your cabinet. If you start 6 months early, it's dead easy. Takes all the stress away if your GP happens to be slow, and it gives you plenty of opportunity to find a different source. There's a number of third-party companies out there that do it for you.
Adrian, you're nodding.
Yeah, so you asked about is the GP marker working, the digital marker? Yes, it is, just to support Chris. But it's really important that we remove the myths that just because the GP tells us about someone's medical pathway that they think the police come around to their house and take their guns. That's simply not correct, and we can evidence that in lots of different formats. There are occasions when we will, but the fact that a licence holder goes to see their GP because they are struggling or there are issues is a good thing. GPs will contact us and we will have a sensible, pragmatic conversation as to around what the issues are, which includes the licence holder, which includes their family or anybody else that we need to speak to. So to suggest or think that we're straight away after people's guns is simply not correct. We need to understand people's pathway in life. If they've asked for support, then they should have just that. And maybe shooting is part of their positive health and well-being, so that should obviously continue. So really important that we bring that to the forefront.
Paul, one of the things we've covered on Field Sports Channel is that because of this fear which Adrian puts forward, that if you go to your GP and say, I'm feeling a bit anxious, somebody will take away your gun certificates. It's almost created a two-speed health service where we shooters can no longer acknowledge that we have a problem with anxiety or depression or anything like that, where we have to constantly be upbeat. Is that the experience in Essex?
We brought the medical screening reports in prior to the new stat guidance, and we brought them in just before COVID, which wasn't a good idea, but we didn't know COVID was around the corner. We have also engaged with the local medical committees within Essex, and for the past 2 years we've been running seminars with the GPs on a bi-monthly basis to explain to them about the shooters. We don't want them to be making decisions on whether people have guns. That's our decision. All we want is the medical facts from them. And I genuinely believe that these seminars have helped, because the majority of the GP surgeries within Essex now are engaging. They're informing us if somebody comes in with a problem. And as Adrian said, we do not automatically go around and seize guns just because somebody's got a problem. Each case has to be done on its own merits. As Chris said, just because you mentioned stress at work 8 years ago, that doesn't mean that you're a problem now. And if you're treated for a mental health condition and you're currently stable because the medication you're on is correct, then there shouldn't be a problem.
You're fine.
Mental health is not an automatic barrier against certification.
Okay. That's really good to hear. We are responsible, I think, for some of the myths that have come out, and I apologise to you for that, but Devon and Cornwall had a problem. They were seizing guns from people in the middle of the night using armed officers, and that just, one of the things we think of ourselves as firearm and shotgun certificate holders is we are better citizens than other people. We have been judged to be better citizens, and then a police officer says, no, you're not, you're suddenly worse than everybody else in the middle of the night with guns. That was the thing we found difficult. But you're saying that just is not happening now, that we're past that.
No, that's right. I'm a firearm and shotgun certificate holder myself. I shoot, but clays and quarry. And I've spoken to my doctor, and they're very good about it. They know the marker is on, and they're absolutely brilliant.
Adrian, it felt like it was all working in about 2019. We had improvements we would have liked to have made from the shooting side. There was talk about centralising the register and things like that. But we're on our way back to it working again. Could you predict, when will we get to a point where the shooters of Britain will start saying it's fine? The lead times are down to a normal level. Everything's acceptable. Can you say next year, the year after?
So what I would say is here and now there's a lot of forces that are performing really well in relation to their turnaround times, which I appreciate you keep picking up on. So that improvement is already in place. But let's be really clear and honest, for some forces, which obviously still have some work to do, as Warwickshire Police have the national portfolio for firearms licence, and we actively engage with those forces. We understand their pathways. We've introduced data performance gathering, which we do quarterly, so we can understand force performance. It allows us to align forces with others which are performing well. Temporary permits has been a big issue, which obviously falls from the back end of COVID, and it's really important that those that come down, which they are doing as per the statutory guidelines. Grant applications, as Chris said, is what we really need to consider. To make sure that obviously people get a good service. I shoot myself. I expect my licence to come to me and not have to wait. So when we broaden the subject more to a potential increase in licensing fees, people will expect a good, efficient and consistent service from policing, and that's certainly what my Chief Constable is really keen to deliver on. So when will that happen? As I said, it's happening now. Some of the forces with the backlogs we're working very closely with. And some of those forces I'm quite sure will be clear by the early part of next year, and that allows you to return to that business as usual around grant applications. But one thing that you will never have timelines around will be assessment of suitability, because it manifests in many different ways. And you can't just have a rule book that says it will take an extra 6 weeks if someone's got medical issues or complications, or someone is midway through a criminal investigation, etc., etc. And that part is obviously different. So I think the improvement is there. What I'm really keen to see as we move into next year, that figures from forces are public facing, so there shouldn't be any myths and secrecy around force performance, so we can explain to people what we do. That's what we do in Warwickshire. You're more than welcome to have our figures.
Look, thank you. I've got to stop it there, but thank you so much for coming along. Thank you for increasing our vocabulary about this.